It's 9 a.m. in Singapore, midday in Sydney, 8 o'clock on Wednesday evening in New York City. I'm Rishad Salamat, coming to you from BloombergMarkets8am headquarters here in Hong Kong. This is Bloomberg Markets. A mixed start for the Asia-Pacific. The Fed keeping rates on hold. Attention now turning to Friday's payroll numbers. Toyota among the day's losers. Its U.S. sales fell 11% last month despite industry-wide discounts. And the Modi government woos the poor, rural voters, and does so with promises of tax cuts and spending. We'll assess Arun Jaitley's budget. We're starting off the session right here in Hong Kong. In about 30 minutes, of course, we have China, Greater China, but at least in the shape of Shenzhen and Shanghai. Closed again, still for that Lunar New Year holiday. We've also got, at the moment, a Hong Kong market, as I say, coming on stream at the bottom of the hour. Singapore, Taipei, and Kuala Lumpur have just started their session. And, well, I guess, is it more of the same here, Sophie?
Well, certainly seems to be the case so far. A tepid start for Asia and a mixed picture across the region. We do have materials and IT stocks leading the gains. In Asia, we have, of course, what's going on around economic data driving some of the sentiment we're seeing across different assets. Taking a look at what's going on in the ASX 200, we did get that trade balance number this morning, and we do have shares rising for a second day in Sydney. New Zealand on the retreat after a marginal gain on Wednesday, and the Kospi up 0.4%. The shares certainly seeing some pickup here, given the inflation number that we saw this morning. And a quick note, we do have Glencore trading halted this morning, pending a full year output report. Now let's take a look at what's going on in the currency space, because we did see a spike in the yuan. It's now at a 3-month high. The dollar yuan fell below the 200-day moving average for the first time since November 10th. This after the CPI data rose by the most since October 2012. More on that with David a little later. Let's take a look at what's going on with the Aussie as well. We did see it break through that 76 US cents level, and we are seeing little chart resistance going towards the 77 area here. And we aren't seeing much reaction, though, in the Aussie bond curve. Now let's pull up this chart on the terminal hashtag BTV2033 to show you that trend that we're seeing and that trade balance. You can see that spike in green on the far right of your screen. That's that record surplus that we saw at 3.5 billion Aussie dollars, coming in higher, of course, than that estimate for 2 billion. 8 of 25 economists had projected the number to surpass the 2.24 billion record surplus set back in February 2009. So a sizable beat there, Rish.
Thank you, Sophie. Right. Well, the Federal Reserve giving a nod to the rising economic confidence generated by Donald Trump's presidency, while also leaving rates unchanged. Now, global economics and policy editor Catherine Hayes is got more for us on that. Now, it's all about what the Fed said here, and in some cases, as ever, Catherine, what the Fed didn't say.
Exactly. Maybe some are hoping for more, Rish, given that Donald Trump has gotten many businesses and even some consumers revved up about the possibilities for a stronger economy based on policy steps he intends to take. But the Fed left its key rate unchanged. Certainly they're not going to move yet until they see how those expectations and hopes play out. 0.5% at the Fed funds rate, the key short end of the curve. One sentence in the policy statement seems to acknowledge that Donald Trump is changing psychology. Here it is. Measures of consumer and business sentiment have improved of late. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it's only a 5-paragraph statement, so this really stood out. Let's jump into the Bloomberg now. 4109 to look at consumer confidence. You can see expectations rising even faster than the overall index in that chart, and that the bottom line is present situation. Present situation not as bright as people's expectations for the future, but that's the power, I guess, of Donald Trump on many sectors. Bottom line, Bloomberg Intelligence said today the Fed chose not to rock the boat, in the fact that there's no signal or hint of coming rates or changes they're looking for. Hard to do in such a short statement. Nevertheless, BI, Bloomberg Intelligence, saying this kind of confirms no change in March. You have to wait for June.
Well, indeed, and Donald Trump railing against the strength of the dollar, while Fed officials have been really downplaying the impact that has on the economy. Now, the thing is, how far will this be a concern at the Fed March meeting? or will it be at all? Of course, it's going to only be an issue if we see further strength, I suppose.
Well, you know, Rish, but you have to look at right now what could happen to the strong dollar, weaker manufacturing. But jump into the Bloomberg because we got the ISM Manufacturing Index, Purchasing Managers Index climbing in January, 56, well above 50 now. And the market PMI, they're also moving higher in tandem. So this is a sign that, at least for now, maybe the dollar's not strong enough, long enough to make a difference. Also in focus today, of course, is the Bank of England. They'll be meeting. And what we've seen in England, which I just want to mention quickly, is that in this post-Brexit economy, we've got inflation still rising, suddenly maybe some crimping of higher import prices on the consumer. But the question is, what will the debate be like at the Bank of England, Rish? In other words, no change expected, but will they boost their inflation forecast? Will they signal that maybe their tilt is changing, realizing that inflation continues to rise? Highest inflation expectations in the UK since 3 years. Let's quickly jump into the terminal here, 46.52, and you can see this index of the inflation expectations going up and up.
Yeah, I mean, Kathleen, the thing is, we've got that chart up, and we're looking at it at the moment. I mean, half of this is essentially down to sterling and sterling's the rapid depreciation following what happened on June the 23rd. Now, the point is, these are base effects, aren't they?
Yes, they are, but they're effects that you can't ignore because this is the hope has been that the weak pound would help exporters, right? So this is like, let's keep the economy post-Brexit. But if consumer prices are rising because of higher import prices, that's the other side of the coin, Rish. So I think the debate today at the Bank of England may be a little more present and important for the Bank of England and for the markets maybe than the Fed meeting was yesterday.
Thank you so much for that. Kathleen Hayes there joining us from Tokyo, looking at the ECB, looking at the Bank of England, and, of course, the Fed overnight. Right, let's get you over from Tokyo to Sydney and join Heidi Lund there for the first word headlines.
Rish, President Trump has witnessed the swearing-in of former ExxonMobil CEO Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State. Earlier, a 56-43 Senate vote in favor of his appointment saw lawmakers split mostly along party lines. Republicans supported the president's view that Tillerson's background gives him the connections and the skills needed to promote U.S. interests abroad.
Me, as I enter the responsibilities of Secretary of State, that as I serve this president, I serve their interest and will always represent the interest of all of the American people at all times.
Well, meanwhile, President Trump is reported to have threatened to send troops to Mexico. The Associated Press cites a transcript of a phone conversation the president had with his Mexican counterpart, in which Trump accused the Mexican military of being scared by what he calls bad hombres. He said he might send the U.S. Army across the border to, quote, take care of it. The bill to take the UK out of the European Union has passed its first test in Parliament, with lawmakers agreeing to allow the Prime Minister to start negotiations by the end of March. The Commons backed Theresa May by 498 votes to 114, but pro-EU lawmakers warned that should not be mistaken for unconditional support. The government will publish an outline of its Brexit plan later on Thursday. And Facebook rose in extended trade after fourth quarter revenue beat estimates, driven by advertisers' continued push to reach consumers on mobile phones. Sales jumped 51% to $8.8 billion. Monthly active users increased 17% from a year earlier to almost 1.9 billion, two-thirds of that checking in daily, the vast majority doing so on their smartphones. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,600 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Heidi Lund. This is Bloomberg. Rish.
Well, we got this big surprise there from South Korea today. Inflation picking up much, much more than anticipated. That's what it means for policy and policy makers and how it changes the whole conversation. And get over to David. Now, Bank of Korea in a bit of a pickle, isn't it? Because you've not got exactly a strong economy, so you can't really do much in terms of raising rates. But on the other hand, well, you know, that's what you probably do need to do to curb inflation.
Right, Rish, and suddenly we have this, right? I guess just to show you the magnitude of just how much of a surprise that this inflation read came. Have a look at my terminal right now. It's the eco function. You look at South Korea. I know it looks very cluttered, but essentially we were expecting a 1.5% read. What we got was 2%, way over here. So there's your bell curve. There's your normal distribution, if you will. The highest estimate was 1.9% from BNP. This is where we are. So it was a big surprise. And, just like that, we're actually at the central bank's target of 2%. And as you mentioned, of course, it comes at a very complex time for South Korea because, yes, we have exports picking up. That's a clear leading indicator, by the way, of growth. But at the same time, you look at the latest minutes from the BOK. One of the members there, one of the officials, basically flagged the limits to what they can do, especially now that you have rates in the U.S. bound to go up. That's going to loosen policy at some point. In fact, I have another chart. Let me just shift this here. Have a look at the inflation read. And I put this side by side with the official bank rate in South Korea. Obviously, when inflation comes down for various reasons, there's reason to cut. But look at where we are. And look at how big the difference is at the moment of where inflation is and where that official bank rate is. So I'd be very surprised to see what sort of changes, I guess, in what people are expecting the BOK to do. We were just talking to HSBC yesterday, Fred Newman. He expects them to cut, but that was before the data came out. So I'd be very interested to see how this really changes the outlook for rates over in South Korea, Rish.
Well, I guess we're going to turn the conversation now to the bigger one, which is how does this change that chatter over inflation around the world?
Right. Well, I mean, this is just one more data point. That being said, from, I guess, the people that we talked to, Rish, a lot of people have basically pointed out that when you look at the growth in demand, it's not quite there yet to basically ensure or to change people's minds that this is more than just a base effect from last year. But that being said, though, another chart, have a look at this. This is a City Inflation Global Surprise Index. And what essentially this measures is the variance or just how far or just how much inflation has undershot or overshot market expectations. We're back to levels of 5 years ago. It turned positive in December. In other words, inflation has been coming in above estimates since the start of December. It's been undershooting targets, undershooting estimates before that for the most part since 2013. So deflation is over. Question is this more than a base effect? Very good chart. Have a look at that. CSIIGL index on your Bloomberg. Rish.
Cheers, thanks for that, David Ingles there. Right, still ahead, MasterCard missing estimates this quarter. We're going to be asking the company's chief marketing officer how the payments network will be pushing its brand here in Asia. Plus, our next guest says markets are vulnerable and that a correction could be just around the corner. We're going to get the take from CMC Markets. Hey, Rick, how are you?
Good morning. I'm pretty well. How are you?
Very well, very well. Let's talk about there's a lot of the Fed obviously, but I think the narrative is changing slightly now. Let's have a look at what's going on. ECB, Bank of England as well later today. Perhaps have a little word on the dollar effect. How much real damage does it do to the U.S. economy? I don't think it does that much, actually, does it? Really, at the end of the day.
No.
It helps with inflation, certainly.
Do you want to talk
it?
about? Have you talked about? Yeah, I was just going to say, have you talked about our trade figures and the Aussie dollar? It's a bit of a game changer.
Yeah, we can mention that as well. Amazing. I mean, the highest on record, which I don't get actually, because I mean that just shows how much does that feed into what slowdown in China? What slowdown?
Well, that's it. I mean, it's higher prices being built on higher volumes. That's why it's a record. It's a pretty interesting number, I think. Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll talk a little bit about that, and about what about trade and trade wars? Yeah, I mean, there's lots in there, and of course, it's all talk and no trousers at the moment, isn't it? When it comes to Donald Trump, for the economy, in fact, there's not even talk because. You're back with Bloomberg Markets as we have a look at the business flash headlines with shares in Mead Johnson Nutrition climbing as much as 21%. This was in after hours, and that was because of Reckitt Benckiser making a bid there. The offer values the baby food maker at about $16.7 billion and would be financed by cash and debt. Mead Johnson shares falling 33% from their 2015 peak, hurt in part by a resurgence in interest in breastfeeding in China and elsewhere. Japan's biggest pharmaceutical company beating third-quarter estimates and raising its profit forecast for the second time in recent months. Takeda Pharmaceuticals seeing revenue of $4.1 billion in the 3 months to the end of December. That as it got a boost from higher sales of gastroenterology drugs. Meantime, it also raised its full-year profit forecast to just over $800 million. Volkswagen has agreed to pay $1.2 billion to resolve U.S. consumer claims over cheating emissions tests on large diesel engines. The proposed settlement is with the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, and the drivers of about 78,000 3-litre diesels. It includes VW, Audi and Porsche models. It brings VW's total penalties, buybacks and fixes in North America to more than $23 billion. Right, let's get you back to the market action. Let's see what's going on out there at the moment. And, let's get to Sydney as well, because Rick Spoon is there from CMC Markets. And, Rick, we've got a bit of a mixed bag here. Nikkei on the way down. ASX climbing up. It's extraordinary, isn't it, when fundamentals are ignored, like this massive trade surplus that Australia posted, a record high, 3.5 billion Aussie dollars. And the market is sanguine, apart from, I should say, the Aussie dollar, which has had a move.
Well, that's right. This is a really interesting number, I think, Rish, because not only is this figure a record, but we've seen a really significant increase in upward revision in past numbers as well. So at the very least, we've got a higher base, really, from which to withstand any downturn that we might see in commodity prices. And I think the reason this is a record is that, prices, of course, in the two big commodities we export, iron ore and coal, are a long way from a record, but of course what we're seeing now is higher prices being built on much higher volumes. But where this could be a game changer is what if commodity prices stay pretty strong this year, which of course a lot of people think they may. Fortescue, which has been pretty right about all this, was in the market yesterday saying that they thought that a big cutbacks in Chinese iron ore mining production this year would see the price basically maintained. That could be a real game changer, I think. Certainly a game changer for the Aussie dollar, putting upward pressure on it against its trade-weighted index.
Rick, I want to move on
and also
brevity
for the economy.
Here. Yeah, just let's talk about that, how it could feed into inflation, because we're seeing inflationary pressures building up. UK for, all sorts of different reasons. We had South Korean CPI ahead of forecast. We've got the prospect of higher inflation in the United States, according to the Fed as well. Now, the thing is this country-specific, or is this reflation, or the return to inflation, actually, I should say, for real?
Oh, well, I mean, it must come eventually, Rish. We haven't seen much of the sort of second-round impact of stronger commodities and energy prices flowing through yet. If you look at the US and other places, this recovery has been very slow and grinding, as we know, and underlying and core inflation in most economies around the world is still pretty low. But if we see commodities stay up like this and labour markets continue to tighten, particularly in the US, then yes, we can look forward, I think, to seeing core inflation pick up.
Your take on the Fed and the Fed statement earlier?
Look, I think, reading between the lines, they probably haven't changed their view since December. As things currently stand, it seems to me that it's a choice between 2 or 3 rate hikes, with 3 being the most likely. They've said they want to get to 3% by the end of 2019. That implies 3 a year, and I think things are good enough to start moving along with that average. But of course, like everybody else, they're going to be dependent on what actually does happen to the economy and very much on what the Trump administration does or does not do.
Well, of course, there's all this talk about protectionism, but let's just go back to where we started and talk about that trade number out of Australia, because what it probably does highlight is what slowdown in growth in China, if anything, is going great guns. But what it also shows is that it's still an economy fixed or fixated by growth, which is being engendered by investment spending and infrastructure building.
That's true. And look, you know, I think probably one has to sort of look at this in 12-month chunks, but you're absolutely right. And I think that fixation is likely to persist this year because this is a politically important year for China. So the most likely scenario is maintenance of the status quo, broadly speaking, when it comes to infrastructure spending and growth generally in China.
Rick, great talking to you as ever. Rick Spooner there, CMC, joining us there from Sydney. Right, let's tell you what we have on the way. The Indian government targeting rural voters with promises of tax cuts and spending as well. Going to run through the latest budget. You're watching Bloomberg Markets. Now, India's finance minister has been outlining a budget aimed at boosting consumption and investment. The biggest winners this year appear to be the rural and the real estate side of things. Rosalind Chin has more on this. So give us an idea what he's been doing here, Mr. Jaitley.
So I think the government and the finance minister, Arun Jaitley, has definitely got in mind, A, the state elections coming up on Saturday, and also B, the impact of the ban on high denomination notes, which was put in place last year, which impacted a lot of the lower income and also rural communities in India. So he outlaid a budget that might go some way towards perhaps easing some of that. So there's an increase in infrastructure spending, including low-cost housing and also affordable housing projects, increase in social welfare spending, increase in jobs training and loans to farmers, tax cuts for people earning under 500,000 rupees, which is about $4,700. Tax cuts to 25% for companies with a turnover of under 500 million rupees. Now, that actually takes in 96% of all registered companies in India, and they employ something like 40% of Indian workers. So that should be a boost to that sector as well. And so these are some of the policies which do seem to be aiding the rural communities, the lower income, and also smaller businesses as well in India. And of course, yes, state elections coming up, on Saturday. States like Uttar Pradesh, very important there. And they
hugely important, UP, yeah.
And it has India's biggest rural communities living in that state. So, of course, these are politically important as well as both to the budget as well as to the people of India in supporting the Prime Minister and the government.
So Ross, something here as well, the spending getting a bit of a bump up. Now, that's going to make the fiscal position worse. And, we've got this budget deficit. Now, how are they going to pay for all this?
Well, they say that...
Don't say GST.
Well, yes, that has been discussed, but they say that they are planning a increase of 13% in tax collections. So part of this will be possibly from income tax. GST has been something that's talked about that's supposed to come into place this year. They are saying that they're going to increase spending by 6.6% in the year starting April the 1st. Now, they're also budgeting a 615 billion rupee increase from asset sales, which is actually a bump up from the previous financial year. And you can see that investors pretty much like the sound of what they're hearing, because was a big bump up on the Sensex yesterday, making its biggest post-budget rally in more than a decade.
So 2009 certainly wasn't a very good budget. Look at that, 5.8% down, not received well.
And partly that's because there was news that tax breaks on equity investments wouldn't be diluted, so investors liking the sound of that. But we're also looking ahead to the central bank decision coming up on February the 8th. There could be measures there to help support growth in the economy that looks like it's going to be slowing, at least in the short term.
Ross, thank you very much indeed. Ross Chin there on the Indian budget and indeed Arun Jaitley and his spending plans to help the rural poor. Right, coming up, we've got the new US Defense Secretary starting his first overseas trip, seeking to ease concern among regional allies. We'll have a look at the agenda there. Plus, it is the start of the trading session in Hong Kong in a short while. We have a pre-market pretty much flat, but it's mixed across the Asia Pacific.
Great, thank you.
You're back with Bloomberg Markets Asia. We're looking to the open here in Hong Kong. Lots to digest at the moment. In Australia, for instance, we had a trade surplus blowout number. We're expecting a trade surplus of 2 billion Aussie dollars. We got one of 3.5 billion there. No real reaction when it comes to the Aussie market, when it comes to equities, but certainly the Aussie dollar got a bit of a bump up. South Korea, inflation stirring. 2% was the number year-on-year CPI, as opposed to the estimate of 1.5%. Now, against all this, we have central banks, of course, making waves. We're looking forward to the Bank of England. We're looking forward to the European Central Bank. No changes expected, but we're looking at the directions that they may be going. With the Fed, certainly, still trying to analyze what Donald Trump means for the economy. So it's a wait-and-see policy there for the markets, because there's nothing for them to really grapple with when it comes to all that. It is certainly wait and see, but we're all waiting, aren't we? Anyway, it is the Hong Kong Open. Let's get to Sophie Kamarian.
Hey, Rish, Hang Seng opening slightly lower, set for a third day of losses here. And we do have Taiwan leading the advance so far in Asia, with materials and IT clocking the biggest gains. We have the likes of Taiwan Semiconductor and other chip makers on the advance. This, of course, we have a lot of interest in the area around Apple's supply chain, given the tech giant's strong earnings report. And on the agenda, we do have January Nikkei manufacturing PMI due this afternoon for Taiwan as well as Vietnam. And elsewhere in the region, the Nikkei 225 lower by 1/3% there. We are seeing, of course, some fluctuations in the yen following that Fed decision. Just to take you through some of the equity movers that we're watching today. We do, of course, have a spate of earnings out of Japan. We do have Chugai Pharma following Takeda higher here. It is topping the Nikkei 225, rising almost 10% here. It's its biggest gain since August 2014. The company is forecasting a 14% rise in its annual core operating profit. Nomura Securities says the drug maker's better than expected outlook reflects better progress with new drugs in Japan. We have Hitachi as well, delivering an earnings beat in the third quarter, prompting Goldman to up its price target. In its earnings briefing, we did have Hitachi CFO weigh in on Trump's policy, saying that is the biggest uncertainty for the company. And a last word on Nomura, the stock gaining for a second session. This after earnings for the financial services firm doubled in the third quarter on record overseas profits. So just a taste of how the earnings season is panning out in Japan. Rish.
Right, well, let's get to Sydney now. Let's get the first word headlines. Here's Heidi.
Rish, New Zealand Prime Minister Bill English has warned of growing global tensions as he delivered the annual State of the Nation address. He noted increasingly assertive Russia and China, the arrival of President Trump, Brexit and rising nationalism, but says New Zealand has developed a successful recipe over the years and will keep to it.
We have forged a distinctive place in the global community as a fair-minded people with a successful economy, open to trade, open to investment, and open to other people migrating to our country.
Well, one immigrant, though, is causing problems for the Prime Minister. Tech billionaire and Trump advisor Peter Thiel has sparked a passport for sale dispute after it was revealed that he won New Zealand citizenship in 2011 despite visiting the country only 4 times. Official documents show Thiel was approved for his entrepreneurial skills and philanthropy. Mr. English has denied selling citizenship to wealthy foreigners. The longtime frontrunner for the French presidency is under increasing pressure to withdraw as concern grows about him employing his family members on public money. François Fillon has asked his Republican Party for time to put his campaign back on track, but polls 3 months out from the election find support is draining away. Fillon denies giving his wife and children non-existent jobs. Iran has confirmed it carried out a missile test at the weekend and warned the world not to meddle in its affairs. Defense Minister Hossein Dagan said Iran has no aim but to defend itself and would neither seek permission nor allow others to interfere. The launch is the first diplomatic test of the Trump administration. The US ambassador to the UN has already said Iran's actions are unacceptable. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,600 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Heidi Lun. This is Bloomberg. Rish.
The new U.S. Defense Secretary will seek to smooth relations with America's Asian allies as he tours the region in the first overseas trip by a member of President Trump's cabinet. Asia government reporter Isabel Reynolds, and she joins us now from Turkey. Now, how important, Isabel, is James Mattis's trip?
Oh, this is absolutely a crucial visit on this occasion. As you say, this is the first Trump cabinet member to make a foreign trip, and he's chosen Asia as his venue. So governments in South Korea and Japan are very relieved, in a sense, that this shows that America is still concerned with security in this region and determined to be involved. If you want to look at the root of the concerns about this, you have to go back to the election campaign, where we saw Donald Trump saying things like that South Korea and Japan were having a free ride on defense, that they weren't paying enough for the presence of US troops here. He even said that he would be comfortable with both countries going nuclear potentially, and that he might pull the troops out. These kind of things are not very comforting for countries like South Korea and Japan, which rely very heavily on the US for their own defense. Now, obviously, Donald Trump has, on the phone, reconfirmed his commitment to these alliances, but I think it's very different to actually have a member of his close advisorship in the region and saying these things on the ground.
Well, indeed, and North Korea is the chief concern, is it now, not in South Korea and Japan, and also, of course, a resurgent China in the South China Sea.
Right, yes, those are the two main issues, obviously. Mattis is set to arrive, I think, in South Korea in approximately 2 hours. He won't be speaking in public there, but he will probably be offering reassurances about how the US commitment to defend South Korea does stand. He's expected to speak on Saturday in Tokyo after talks with his counterpart, Defense Minister Inada. And what they're looking for in Japan is really a commitment to that bilateral defense agreement, and particularly that it covers the islands which are disputed between Japan and China, which have long been a potential flashpoint, and tensions could rise further if America doesn't step up and say publicly that it stands by its commitment over those islands.
Isabel, thank you very much indeed. Isabel Reynolds. Now let's find out what's been happening in the automotive industry in the US with car sales slowing in January after seeing a December that was actually the best in a decade. Rami, in a sense, has been delving through the numbers. And let's kick things off, Rami, with a look at the top line first.
Yeah, sure, Rish. Well, basically, it was better than expected. The number coming out for January, 17.6 million automobiles sold for the month of January. The expectation was for 17.3 million. But looking at it relatively to January of 2016, that's still a fall of about 300,000 from 17.9 million, down by about 2%, nearly 2% there, as you can see. As you can see also, December 2016, you mentioned 18.4 million, the best in terms of sales for a decade. Now, what contributed to this fall? Let's take a look at the biggest losers first off, and that would be right there, Toyota, as well as Fiat Chrysler. Look at that, down 11% year on year. Toyota missed their estimate. The estimate was for a fall of about 2%, so down 9 percentage points there. Fiat Chrysler, though, was a beat only by 3 percentage points. But the issue here is that for Toyota, it's getting hurt, Rish, by cheap gas. It's probably down by $1 over the past 3 years or so, at about $2.25 a gallon. Because of that, because of cheap gas, people are opting for larger trucks, larger SUVs, because they can afford the energy there. That's also hurting Fiat Chrysler. All brands are down except for Ram Truck. Again, a truck up 5.5% in terms of sales year on year. Other big name auto falls, GM and Ford. Ford, not so bad, down about 1% there, better than the estimate of nearly 3%. GM, though, worse than expected, down nearly 4%. The estimate was for about 2.5%. Similar story. Big trucks as well as cheap gas. But, Rich, there was some good news, and the good news there was for 3 specific companies. One was for Volkswagen. Now, interestingly enough, Volkswagen sales rose, get this, 15% for January year on year. The expectation, though, was for 20%. That was a miss. With that said, 15% is still not a number to sneeze at. So we're seeing some rebound off of that diesel emission scandal that has been plaguing the company over the past year and a half or so. You can also see Nissan and Honda up by about 6% or so. Again, the deal is that because of all this cheap gas that's around, people are just driving into the SUVs, Rish, as well as those higher-end trucks. Rish.
Thanks very much indeed for that. Of course, Rami Inocencio there in New York, just going through all these issues at the moment coming through when it comes to car sales in the United States. Looking also at what's been going on with Macau as well. Bumpy ride perhaps to recovery. Of course, this is the world's biggest gaming hub by a massive stretch here. Casino revenue growth has slowed down, though, in January again. Asia markets reporter Lisa Pham is with me now, having a look at, gaming revenue up 3.1%. But analysts were looking at, Lisa, what 3.5% were they as an increase? So, I mean, we were all touting that there was going to be a recovery. Where are we?
So analysts were looking at a median estimate of 8.5%. The analysts I spoke to were looking at between 5% and 12% year-on-year growth, whereas as we saw in January, it was only up 3.1%. So that was quite disappointing for quite a few people.
Better than the declines that we were having, but I guess when we look at the base effects here, they should be doing better than this.
Yeah, so this year we had Chinese New Year starting in January, whereas last year it started in February. So we did have analysts that were hoping that the Chinese New Year effect would have a good impact on the January revenues. So it was disappointing, but what some analysts did say to me was that there are some VIP high rollers that tend to come to Macau after the Chinese New Year, after that really big period. So we may see some better numbers in February.
Right, looking at what Anna's saying about February, what are they saying about the next few months as well here?
So in February, that's going to be like a big.
Do you think a lift up? I mean, what are we talking about here? Because, I mean, you say those high rollers might be coming, so that could provide a little bit of a boost, I suppose.
Yeah, that's correct. So it's really going to be in the next week or so that we'll have a better idea about where the recovery is going, whether the high rollers do come during this Chinese New Year period because the holiday is still going ahead, and whether or not this is going to have a good number.
Lisa, tell me something though. I mean, we had 2 years where Macau was really in the doldrums, a slump there taking place. Now, we've had 6 months, very briefly, on the way up. Is the recovery intact?
So there was some analysts who think that there is like a bit of a choppy road ahead. We have had that 2-year slump that was caused by the anti-corruption campaign and fears about a slowing Chinese economy. Those fears still exist among some players.
Thank you very much indeed, Lisa Pham there. Right, still ahead. Courting the consumer. Find out what MasterCard is doing to boost revenue after missing earnings. A target, should I say, last quarter. Going to be hearing from the Chief Marketing Officer. That is on the way.
How long have you been with MasterCard?
4 years.
Yes, I can, thanks. 4 years, did
4
you say?
years now, yeah.
Prior to that?
I was in the health industry for 4 years.
Oh, wow.
And I went through Obamacare. And before million people are there on it, and they will have to find a replacement for that. In the current form, Obamacare, you cannot afford it. It's very expensive. And there's an escalation of premiums that's happening every year, like 150%, 200% state by state. That's something which has to be checked. So they'll have to come up.
Let's have a quick check of the latest business flash headlines. JP Morgan and certain affiliates have agreed to pay almost $800 million to resolve all remaining litigation from the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy. The bank also handed over $1.4 billion last year, the new deal requiring bankruptcy court approval. Hearing is set for February the 16th. Now, Lehman, of course, the biggest bankruptcy in U.S. history back in September 2008 with more than $600 billion in debt and liabilities. Teva has lost its first bid to block copies of its multiple sclerosis drug from hitting the market, while it appeals a ruling that invalidated patents on the medicine. US just denied the company's request, saying that it was unwarranted. Teva may appeal the latest decision and push another court to issue a ban against generic sales, at least until that patent dispute is resolved. Now, longtime rivals Etihad Airways and Lufthansa say a broader alliance could be on the way. This after announcing an agreement on catering and aircraft maintenance. The $216 million contract will see Lufthansa provide in-flight food and plane upkeep for Etihad. Chief Executive James Hogan said the accord marks a major step and that more tie-ups are being discussed. Now, President Trump's latest, or should I say first, policy decisions and appointments have sparked concern around the world, but there's also optimism that he'll spark growth in the United States and abroad. Well, Hasina Amin joins us now. And Haz, you've got a guest here. Just tell us what's really fueling this positive view, this optimistic view.
Well, Rish, a couple of reasons. Prospects of lower taxes, fewer regulation, even prospects of higher spending on infrastructure. That's pretty much prompting the optimism. And one company that's buying into that story is MasterCard. It says that Trump's election is net positive for the economy. Let's get perspective from MasterCard's Chief Marketing Officer, Raja Rajamana, joins us this morning. Raja, good to have you with us. This
Thank
optimism,
you for having me.
How does MasterCard hope to benefit from it? Because when you take a look at innovation, for example, innovation can only happen in an unrestricted environment, yet Trump has come out to say that he's against immigration and also free trade.
See, I think there are multiple facets to it, right? President Trump, obviously, he believes that there is a tremendous amount of regulation that is burdening the businesses, whether they are large businesses or small businesses. And he is trying to take actions in that direction. And when there is a stimulation of the businesses that are happening in the country, that's going to be very positive for the economy. Same thing about investment in the infrastructure. And when you have investment happening in the infrastructure, that's really going to give you an impetus.
How exactly do you see MasterCard benefiting? And how will that translate to earnings going forward?
See, from MasterCard's perspective, if you look at our business model, right, we are a technology company. And we enable movement of money and data. And when there is more economic activity that is happening, that obviously will benefit MasterCard, both at the consumer side as well as on the business side. Right? Where the economy is thriving, obviously consumers are going to spend more. They're going to be participating more in the economic flows. And that's obviously how we make our money. And so from that point of view, when there is infrastructural investment that is happening, when businesses are being enabled by lesser burden of regulation and lesser taxes, hopefully, I think that's going to be good.
Talent is an issue. Trump has said that it's against immigration. It's put a lid on it. But MasterCard is big on diversity. Do you think Trump's policy would, I guess, hold you back from moving and retaining talent?
See, we are, as a company, extremely committed to diversity and inclusiveness. In fact, our CEO has recently gone on record to say that. And it's something which we are concerned about. And this is an area that we are watching. We will continue to treat diversity and inclusiveness as a competitive advantage and a strength. When you talk of innovation, this really gets enabled by the diverse set of talent that you have got around the world, and we strongly believe in it. So this is an area that we are concerned about, and we are sort of looking out.
Raja, I want to talk about your earnings released this week. Investors obviously didn't like the numbers. Your stocks were slammed down 3%. Well, basically revenue misestimates, partly because of the strong dollar. What are the prospects given that the dollar is expected to get even stronger from here, despite Trump trying to talk down the dollar?
See, dollar, of course, has got an impact in terms of what its rate of exchange is. But more importantly, if you look at the fundamentals of our business, we believe we had a solid year, right? In terms of transactions, as in terms of gross domestic volumes, we have had a solid growth. We have delivered to our expectations.
Is that sustainable going forward?
Absolutely. That's exactly what our belief is. You know, we are investing in digital. We are investing in safety and security. We are investing in a lot in innovation. Now, each one of these is going to help drive MasterCard to be ahead of the game, right? And if you look at the penetration of cash across most societies, or digital as opposed to cash, the penetration is pretty small. You know, it's like 85% still does in terms of transactions that happen in the world on a value basis. They're all cash-based or check-based.
Let's pick up on digital because India is a big market for you. You're betting big. Investments there up 30% over the last 2 years. But when you take a look at this billion people, only 950 million still without proper access to the internet. How do you convert that? How do you then benefit from such a population?
The opportunity out there is gigantic, as you have rightly identified.
And so are the challenges.
So are the challenges, absolutely. This is not a sprint, it is a marathon, right? And what we see is when we are enabling unique technologies in the ecosystem, whether it is like, we have got this product called MasterPass we have launched, and different versions of it. If, for example, the traditional point of sale terminals are not there, can we have a QR version of the product? Now, we are coming up with innovations in terms of products and enabling the entire ecosystem, and we are optimistic, and we partner with the banks, we partner with the merchants, both from an acceptance point of view as well as for card issuance point of view, and we actually have programs which stimulate consumers getting engaged and motivated to go towards using their cards as opposed to using cash or alternate forms of payment. And I believe, and we believe as a company too, that this is where a huge opportunity is. As much as there could be challenges, and therefore it is not a sprint, it's not going to happen overnight, it is a gigantic opportunity. And it's a direction that we will continue to march along, and therefore there is optimism.
All right, Roger, we thank you for your insights. Now, Raja Rajamana, Chief Marketing Officer of MasterCard Rish, pretty upbeat about prospects.
He certainly seems it, doesn't he? Anyway, one company not particularly upbeat, it's been Sony of late. It's struggling. The Japanese giant is set to report third quarter earnings as its movie business hits some rather tough times. Sony said to report its third quarter earnings a bit later today. That as the chief executive, Kazu Hirai, arrives in California. He's going to take up temporary residence there, actually, and try to revive the troubled movie business. Bloomberg's Yuji Nakamura joins us from Turkey. Now, Yuji, what are we looking for, actually, in this quarter?
Yeah, they've already preempted the earnings on Monday by announcing that big write-off in the movie division. So I probably ignore kind of the net income number or don't pay too much attention to it because it'll be disrupted by that big write-down. I'd focus on the top line, revenue, look at operating profit, see how the core business is doing. I'd really focus on those things. Specifically within that, I think there's probably two things to look at. Obviously games, which is their biggest division. Last quarter, very important. It's the holiday quarter where a lot of stuff is released. And Sony, I think this year it was especially important because they released their virtual reality headset. They also upgraded the performance of their PlayStation 4 with the beefier, more powerful version. So you want to see how those two are doing. So I'd look for that. The other thing is, as always, look for components. See that they supply a lot of the camera sensors for Apple, for example. We saw Apple's earnings actually weren't that bad. For the past year, the global smartphone industry has been worrying about a slowdown. And Apple's figures, they were pretty good. We want to see if Sony also benefits from perhaps a pickup in demand for smartphones. So games and smartphones, I'd look for those things. The net number at the bottom line, maybe not that much.
Yuji? What about, this? I mean, it always seems to be something biting at Sony's heels, doesn't there? I mean, last year we had the earthquake, then we had the battery sale, and now this movie issue.
Yeah, exactly. It seems like every quarter there's something kind of biting at the heels of Sony. Even though their core business, again, of games and making components is doing well, there's always some kind of write-down that gets thrown in there. I mean, the earthquake was very unfortunate last April. It stopped production of a lot of the chips that they make that go into smartphones and digital cameras. It is frustrating for investors because Sony has been trying to, Kazu Hirai has been trying to turn the company around for the last 4 or 5 years.
Yuji?
And, they're definitely in a much better place now. But it looks like they're not completely out of the woods yet. Hopefully, I think next fiscal year we might see a more cleaner Sony that has all of its components there, yeah.
Yuji, great talking to you. See you soon, Yuji Nakamura. Then, and before we leave things here, we've got a volcano in Hawaii putting on a dramatic show. It's a powerful lava stream from Mount Kilauea. It's pouring into the sea off this Hawaiian island and sending plumes of steam into the atmosphere. The gusher opened up earlier this week and has been flowing steadily ever since. The lava currently poses no threat to nearby communities, but the U.S. Geological Survey is warning locals and tourists to keep well aware. I'll leave you with these images.